Well, good evening. My name is Evan Gregory, and this is once again Bible Answers. We're going to be starting to look at Acts chapter 18 tonight, so follow along on the screen here. And as always, this is a live show. If you got a question or comment, feel free to leave it. I'll try to answer it, even if I have to maybe come back at a later time to do it. And as always, this is brought to you by North Columbus Church of Christ, located in Columbus, Mississippi. And the website is scrolling below me is northcolumbuschristians.com. So getting right into the lesson again, we're looking at Acts chapter 18, and we'll be finishing part of it tonight. And so Paul is making his way into really the Italy area, if I recall correctly. And he was at Athens at the end of Acts chapter 17. And now he's making his way to Corinth. And one thing we have to, I think, recognize is with Corinth that it was described as historically a very immoral, or the people there were very immoral individuals. And so we'll see what the effect of the gospel has. We also see where Paul writes multiple letters to the church that is established at Corinth as well. And so even the church there dealt with various issues, and you could kind of see how maybe the culture around them affected their ability to serve God. And so Acts chapter 18, beginning in verse 1, it says, after these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth, and he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. And he came to them. So, because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked for by occupation. There were tent makers, and he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded both Jews and Greeks. So, we see Paul meeting Aquila and Priscilla, and we'll hear more about them later in the book of Acts. But notice it says they had come from Italy, and it says because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. And so, from what I could understand from understanding is that there was at this time, um, according to what was written, that there was a fellow by the name of Crestus that was instigating the Jews, and some will say that this Crestus was actually a reference to Jesus Christ. Now, I don't know that for sure, but we see where the Jews were riled up, and obviously we could see from what we read in Acts that the Jews were riled up about Christians in general to the point where they're following Paul around. But again, we don't know what reason. But again, apparently they were Jews, and they come because of this decree for them to leave Rome. Claudius is fed up with them; he wants them to go, and so we see where they were tent makers as well as with Paul. Now, interesting enough, he sees that he worked here, and he didn't. And if I remember correctly, this was in the Corinthian letters as well. That he made a point where he did not, in certain cases, he had a right to have churches provide for him, but he would not do that if for whatever reason he felt that it wasn't not the best thing to do, and he actually was willing to work and to provide for himself, uh, so that he could continue to spread the gospel. And it's interesting we see that idea, and frankly, that concept of individuals spreading the gospel, that they were working for themselves in order to provide for themselves, is just seems like it's becoming less and less. We don't see that much, especially not in this country. And for them, this was the norm. And so we see where he stayed with them. They were of the same trade. And what is he doing? Well, the same thing that he's always doing. What we'd come to expect from Paul is that he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath, and he was persuading both Jews and the Greeks. And so we go to verses 5 through 8. It says, when Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia, Paul was compelled by the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. But when they opposed him and blasphemed, he shook his garments and said to them, your blood be upon your own heads. I'm clean. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. And he departed from there and entered the house of a certain man named Justus, one who worshiped God, whose house was next door to the synagogue. Then Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his household, and many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed and were baptized. So we see Silas and Timothy joining him, and we see where Paul was compelled by the Spirit. The Lord was telling him, in some manner, that he needed to testify to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. So he continued to do that, and again, as kind of what we would expect, that some believed, but many Jews, they acted violently against Paul. They opposed him. It says they blasphemed, and he finally gets to a point where he has enough. It says that he shook his garments, and you will see it in the Gospels, this concept of shaking the dust off your feet. When we get into situations like this, and it's just the same concept, that it's just showing that I've done what I can, and I'm done with you, and I'm going to go about doing something else. And he says, your blood be upon your own heads. I'm clean. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. So he's saying, basically, I've told you what you needed to hear, and that you refuse to believe it, and so you're responsible for that choice. You're going to be judged according to that choice. And then he says, I'm now going to go to the Gentiles. And it doesn't seem like he's just totally done with the Jews, for good. We see him talking with other Jews. We see him going into synagogues after this. But it seems like in this area that he's going to focus on the Gentiles here. And so he goes to enters the house of a certain man named Justus, one who worshiped God. It says his house was next door to the synagogue. Interesting the way this is phrased, that of course, he's right next to the synagogue, which is where the Jews would meet. But the way he's described, I'm not so sure that he was a Jew. It seems like he may be someone like Cornelius in Acts chapter 10, that they worship God, but they're not necessarily a Jew. But nonetheless, I don't think whether he's a Jew or not really depends on understanding this. But it says that he goes to this house, and then we see the ruler of the synagogue, Crispus, believing on the Lord with all of his household. So, like the Philippian jailer, believing with all of his household. And think about what the effect of this would have on the Jews. That we have all of these Jews reacting violently against Paul. And then it says that the ruler of the synagogue was actually believing this. That at least he had a clear enough mind that he didn't get caught up in all of what was going on around him, that he heard, understood, and believed those things, ultimately the truth that was spoken by Paul. And also it says many of the Corinthians hearing. Now notice what, after they heard, what they did. It says they believed and they were baptized. So again, we keep going through the book of Acts, and we see what those converted did, and we start seeing a consistent pattern here, that we're always seeing these individuals believing, they're being baptized. We also don't hear it here or read it here, but also we assume that these individuals, by turning to God, that they repented as well of their sins. And so we see that whole concept throughout the book of Acts of these individuals being converted. And, again, this is part of God's plan for ones to be saved, and that one needs to heed these things written to properly understand what God expects of those that want to become a Christian, want to receive salvation. And so, moving on to verses 9 through 13, we see where Paul has a vision, and it's in the vision. It says, "Do not be afraid, but speak and do not keep silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to hurt you. For I have many people in this city." So the Lord is speaking to him here, and so we see where the Jews are acting. They're putting up a fight against him, and it seems like this is affecting Paul. We see where. In one of the Corinthians later, Paul mentions that he was very. I mean, he was. It seemed like he was nervous about being in the area, and so we see where God reassures him, encourages him, and he says, "No one's going to attack you to hurt you, for I have many people in this city." So God knows that there are going to be people here that need to hear Paul's message. And so again, God's encouraging him. You're not going to die. You're not going to get hurt. There's many people that need to listen to what you have to say, and really to continue doing what you've already been doing. And so he says that he continues there a year and 6 months teaching the word of God. And then it says, when Galileo was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat, saying, "This fellow persuades men to worship God contrary to law." So it says again, Galileo was proconsul of Achaia, and this is, again, where it's close to that Macedonian area. So we have that area of Macedonia and Achaia. You're getting close to this. I guess you would say Italy proper. You're getting more and more close to Rome, anyways. But he's proconsul, and from what I understand, proconsul is kind of like you're like a sub ruler of this little area for Caesar. But anyways, he has some authority, he has power in this region, and we see where the Jews take Paul to the judgment seat, and this is the judgment seat is pretty much literally what it says. That it would be some raised seat that someone like Gallio would listen to these allegations levied against Paul. And it says that, and they said that this fellow persuades men to worship God contrary to law. And again, it's an issue of what that they are. He is saying things and basically saying that the Jews are no longer bound to law because of Christ, and they don't have to keep the law. So yes, he is speaking things contrary to law, but he's not. He's not actively working against it. He's not trying to go to war and stamp out the Jews or anything of that manner, or he's not blaspheming what has been said in the old law to any degree. And so we see where everywhere Paul has been going lately, that the Jews are riled up against him, and we see another case here. So they're trying to get Gallio to do something about Paul. Notice how Gallio responds. He says, "And when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, 'If it were a matter of wrongdoing or wicked crimes, O Jews, there would be a reason why I should bear with you. But if it is a question of words and names and your own law, look to it yourselves, for I do not want to be a judge of such matters.'" So Gallio recognizes that Paul hasn't committed any crime. He's not a murderer. He's not a liar, steal, cheating anybody, anything of that manner. That he recognizes the why the Jews have a problem with Paul is because of their law, and he doesn't want to fool with it. And so he tells them, "You deal with it." He says that he drives them from the judgment seat. And notice what happens. He says, "Then all the Greeks," after Gallio has issued his judgment, it says, "Then all the Greeks took Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat. But Gallio took no notice of these things." So Gallio recognizes what's going on, that Paul's not really committed a crime. And we see that once they hear this, once the Greeks hear this, that apparently the Greeks kind of realize what the Jews are doing, and they're not having it. They recognize that they're trying to, really, do harm against someone who's completely innocent. And we see that they take the ruler of synagogue and actually beat him. And so we see how the tables have turned against the Jews here. And we see that Gallio took no notice of these things. So he listened to what the Jews had to say about Paul, but at this point, he took no notice of these things. He wasn't too worried about this, and so you see that Gallio, as kind of what we've seen about Claudius telling the Jews to leave Rome in Acts chapter 18, that the Romans seem to be just completely fed up with the Jews. And Gallio is not too worried about what happens to the Jews either, looking as to how he responded to the ruler of the synagogue being beat. And again, so it looks like the tables are turning on the Jews. Just the irony of that they were wanting, ultimately the Jews are wanting Paul to be beat or executed, and as it turns out for them, the ruler of the synagogue gets beat at the end of the day. So there's a little bit of irony in that as well. And so that finishes up our study for tonight. We're going to finish up, Lord willing, Acts chapter 18 next week. But as always, you got a question or comment, leave them on this show. I'll respond to it. We also have a YouTube page, North Columbus Church of Christ, and you can find our videos there that we have done previously. And as always, I hope this has been useful for y'all. And until next time, I hope that you all have a good day and a good rest of the week. Thanks.